He only came to buy the barn. That's what he told himself again and again as his wagon wheels cut through the frozen ruts of the road. It was just a business decision, a practical choice for a practical man. Elijah Brandt wasn't looking for trouble. He was a widower with 3 children of his own and a piece of land that was barely holding on. He needed lumber. He needed a place for his cattle to winter. He didn't need another mouth to feed, let alone a ghost to haunt him. The auctioneer's voice was a thin, sharp thing, cracking against the bitter cold. "Final lot of the day, folks. Old Preston barn with all the land it sits on. A good foundation, a strong roof. Take a look for yourselves before we start the bidding." The crowd was already thinning out. The wind had a bite that drove most sensible men home to their fires. Elijah liked it that way. Fewer eyes, fewer questions. He pulled his worn coat tighter and limped toward the final structure, a hulking shadow against the gray sky. An auctioneer's assistant, a boy no older than 16 with boredom carved into his face, led him to the massive doors. "Old man Preston didn't keep much up," the boy mumbled, kicking at a patch of hardened ice. "But the bones are good, roof solid, foundation needs some leveling is all." Elijah didn't answer. He just gripped the cold iron handle of the barn door. It groaned open on rusted hinges, a long, deep sound like a dying animal. He squinted into the gloom, letting his eyes adjust. And then he froze. Every muscle in his body went rigid. The air caught in his lungs. Huddled against the far wall, shrouded in shadows and the smell of hay and fear, was a family. 5 children, their faces smudged with dirt, their eyes wide and empty. They were absolutely silent, motionless, like a photograph of a tragedy. The oldest looked to be around 12. The youngest was a babe in arms, wrapped in a thin, filthy blanket. A woman sat with them, her back ramrod straight against the rough-hewn planks. Her arms were wrapped around the smallest child, a protective cage of bone and sinew. Her dress was threadbare, her hair pinned up in a messy knot, but her eyes were a different story. They were weary, ancient, but they were unblinking. She stared right at him, not with defiance, but with a terrible, patient stillness. She didn't stand, she didn't speak. She just watched him, as if he were a wolf deciding whether to attack. "What in God's name?" Elijah breathed, the words turning to smoke in the frigid air. The assistant didn't even flinch. His voice was flat, devoid of any emotion. "Comes with the lot," he said. "Been here 2 nights. Sheriff evicted 'em." Elijah's mind struggled to catch up. He'd heard of people being left behind, of families losing everything. But this was different. They weren't just homeless. They were being sold, like livestock, like furniture. "Elijah Brandt!" the auctioneer called from behind him. He'd followed them over, a stack of papers in his hand. "You're the only one left with any interest. You want the barn or not?" Elijah couldn't take his eyes off the woman. Off the 5 children who looked more like ghosts than kids. Not a single one of them made a sound. The wind shrieked outside, a lonely, desperate howl that seemed to speak for them. "Who are they?" Elijah asked, his voice low and rough. "Wife and children of Preston's cousin," the auctioneer said with a shrug, like he was discussing the quality of the timber. "Cousin passed last spring. They got no legal claim to the land. Sheriff gave 'em 2 days to clear out. Ain't got nowhere to go." He gestured with his papers. "They've been squatting here since. They come with the barn if you want it. If not, well, the county will have 'em cleared out by morning." Cleared out. Elijah knew what that meant. Separated. Sent to orphanages, work farms, a family torn apart and scattered to the wind. His hands, calloused from years of farm work, twitched at his sides. He looked at the woman again. She was still staring at him, braced for the blow, for the curse, for the dismissal. The child in her lap, sensing his gaze, clutched her dress tighter. "You're not selling people," Elijah said, his voice hard as iron. "No, sir, not selling 'em," the auctioneer agreed easily. Just including 'em. Barn's warmer than the woods, but if you don't buy it, they're out on their ear tomorrow. It's your choice. A choice. It felt less like a choice and more like a test. Elijah didn't speak for a long, heavy moment. The world seemed to shrink down to the space inside that cold, dark barn. He turned his back on the auctioneer and walked inside, his limp more pronounced on the uneven dirt floor. He ignored the man's impatient murmuring. He stopped a few feet from the woman and crouched down, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "What's your name, ma'am?" She hesitated. Her lips were chapped and pale. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, rusty from disuse. "Miriam?" She glanced at the children. "And them. Jacob, Ruthie, Isaiah, Lily, and baby Grace." He counted them. 5. All of them with skin stretched too tight over their bones, their eyes following his every move. Ruthie, the oldest girl, sat like a tiny, fierce statue, her gaze hard and unforgiving for someone so young. "You have any food?" Elijah asked gently. Miriam didn't answer. She just looked away. That told him everything he needed to know. He let out a long, slow breath, a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the whole winter. "I'm not a man with much," he said, his voice honest and plain. "Lost my wife 3 years ago, got 3 of my own to raise, and barely enough land to feed us all. But I won't leave a woman and 5 children to freeze, not in God's name." She didn't cry. She didn't thank him. She just looked at him with an expression of profound disbelief, as if he'd just spoken in a language she'd never heard before. Elijah stood up, his joints cracking in the cold. He turned back to the auctioneer, his decision made. "I'll take the barn," he said, his voice loud and clear. "I'll pay you right now." The auctioneer's face split into a grin of relief. He was done for the day. An hour later, the papers were signed. The land was his. The barn was his. And so, by a cruel twist of fate, was the silent, broken family huddled inside it. He led them to his wagon. Miriam walked behind him, still clutching baby Grace, her steps slow and uncertain. The other children followed in a single-file line, a small, sad procession. Not one of them spoke. Not one of them complained. He bundled them in the spare blankets he kept in the back of the wagon, the rough wool doing little against the piercing cold. His own children, Anna, Thomas, and Sam, were waiting for him back at home. They didn't know it yet, but their world was about to change forever. As the wagon lurched forward, one of the little boys, Jacob, spoke up. His voice was small but clear. "You married, mister?" Elijah paused for a beat before answering. "No, son, not anymore." "My pa's dead too," Jacob said, his voice matter-of-fact. "Mama says he was a good man." "I'm sure he was," Elijah said softly. The rest of the long ride was silent. Miriam never said another word, just stared out at the passing landscape of skeletal trees and frozen fields. Elijah's ranch was 20 miles east, a small, crooked homestead carved out of the unforgiving plains. It wasn't much. A lopsided house, a slanting barn, a fence that was in constant need of mending, but it was his. When they heard the wagon approach, his 3 children came running out, their faces bright with expectation. They skidded to a halt when they saw the strangers huddled in the back. Anna's smile faltered. Thomas's eyes narrowed with suspicion. Sam just stared, confused. "Inside," Elijah ordered gently, his voice leaving no room for argument. "We'll talk after supper." Miriam and her 5 children filed into the small house. Elijah's 3 followed, casting wary glances over their shoulders. There was no way to explain it all at once. The truth, he knew, would have to come out in pieces. Supper was a tense, quiet affair. The house felt crowded, packed with unspoken questions and simmering anxieties. But Miriam moved through the chaos with a quiet grace. She didn't need to be asked. She found the plates, served the stew, and fed her youngest children first, her movements efficient and practiced. She waited until every single person had eaten before she finally took a small plate for herself. Elijah watched her hands tremble as she lifted the spoon to her lips. It wasn't from nerves. It was from starvation. He watched her carefully, looking for a sign, a clue to the mystery she carried. She didn't complain. She didn't ask for anything. She simply existed, a quiet storm in the center of his home. Later that night, after all 8 children had been settled in pallets on the floor, wherever they could find space, Elijah sat alone on the porch, the cold air a welcome shock to his system. The door creaked open behind him. It was Miriam, with Grace asleep on her shoulder. "Why'd you do it?" she asked, her voice soft in the darkness. He didn't answer right away. He stared out at the vast, empty plains under a blanket of cold stars. "Because someone had to," he said finally, "and because I know what it's like to lose everything." She nodded once, a small, sharp movement in the gloom. "But I'm not offering charity," Elijah continued, his voice firm. "I need hands on this land. I need meals cooked, boots mended, animals fed. My own kids need looking after, and if I'm being honest, I could use some too." "I'll work," Miriam said immediately. "They will too, as soon as they're able." "Then we'll call it even," he said. She turned to leave, but paused at the door. "My husband, he died of a fever," she said, her voice barely audible. "The land we were on, it was never really ours. Preston, the owner, he let us stay, but after he passed, his family sold it off. We had nowhere else to go. I thought I was doing the right thing, keeping them together, keeping them fed. But we just ended up as something to be thrown away with the rest of the rubbish." Elijah finally met her eyes in the dim light from the window. "You're not thrown away here," he said simply. Miriam didn't smile. He wasn't sure he'd ever see her smile, but she held Grace a little tighter, and for a moment, the crushing weariness in her eyes seemed to lessen, just a fraction. The next morning, before the sun had even thought about rising, Elijah's daughter, Anna, found Ruthie outside. The girl, who couldn't be more than 12, was already breaking the thick layer of ice from the water trough with a heavy mallet, her small frame straining with the effort. "You don't have to do that," Anna began, surprised. "Yes, I do," Ruthie said, not even looking up. Her voice was flat, final. By the time Elijah emerged from the house, Isaiah and Jacob were stacking firewood by the back door, their movements precise and practiced. Lily, the quiet one, had already taken to sweeping the floors, and Miriam was at the kitchen table, mending one of Elijah's torn coats by the faint light of a lantern. She looked up as he passed, and for the very first time, she gave him a small nod. It wasn't a nod of fear or even gratitude. It was something else, something that looked a lot like respect. But peace was a fragile thing on this land. That night, long after the children were asleep, Elijah stepped outside for a breath of fresh air and found his oldest son, Thomas, waiting for him by the fence. Thomas was 14, with his father's silence and his mother's sharp eyes. "You really trust them?" Thomas asked, his voice low. Elijah looked back at the warm light spilling from the windows of his home. "No," he admitted honestly, "but I believe in second chances." Thomas didn't look convinced. He just stared out into the darkness, and from the ink-black shadows of the trees, just beyond the fence line, someone else was watching them. Silent. Still. Utterly unseen. Whoever it was had followed the wagon all the way from the auction. And they hadn't come to offer a second chance. They had come to collect. The tracks in the snow were the first warning. Elijah saw them at dawn. He'd risen earlier than usual, a familiar ache in his bones telling him the weather was about to turn. On his way to check the chicken coop, his eyes caught the trail. It was a single set of prints, heavy and deliberate, winding along the tree line at the edge of his property. They circled the barn once, then vanished back into the woods. He crouched down, his breath misting in the air. The soles were worn, the stance wide, as if the man carried a heavy weight or walked with a limp. The prints were too large for any of the children, and too fresh to be more than a few hours old. Whoever it was had stood there, in the freezing dark, just watching the house. Watching the porch light that shone like a solitary beacon in the night. Elijah stood there for a long time, his eyes narrowed, scanning the silent, snow-dusted trees. He felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. This wasn't a lost hunter. This was a predator. He turned and walked back to the barn. He checked the main latch, then added a second length of heavy chain for good measure. He didn't like it, but he was a man who listened to his instincts, and his instincts were screaming. Inside the house, the strange new family was already awake. Ruthie had beaten him to the firewood again. The girl moved with the grim efficiency of a grown woman trapped in a child's body. She was quiet, guarded, and always working. Jacob was helping her stoke the hearth, while Isaiah was trying to coax a stubborn calf back into its pen. Miriam was in the kitchen, humming a tune so soft it was barely audible, rocking baby Grace while Lily peeled potatoes with a focus that was unnatural for a girl her age. It was all too orderly, too perfect. It was as if the entire family had rehearsed this life, a life lived under a roof where one wrong move, one complaint, could send them spiraling back into the cold. Elijah didn't like it one bit. "Eat first," he said to Ruthie, his voice gruff. "You've earned a warm meal." "I'll eat after my chores are done," she replied, without looking up from the kindling she was splitting. Elijah didn't push her. He just watched them all, a growing weight settling in the back of his mind. This wasn't just poverty. This was training. Later that morning, while he was splitting logs behind the barn, he called Thomas over. His son's boots crunched through the snow, his hat pulled low over his brow. "Take the rifle," Elijah said, nodding toward the one mounted on the barn wall. "I want you patrolling the perimeter, twice a day. Once before dawn, once before dusk. You see anything, anyone, you come straight to me. No questions, no hesitation." Thomas's eyes narrowed. "Something wrong?" "Just a feeling," Elijah said. "And I've learned to trust my feelings." Thomas grabbed the rifle without another word. He'd inherited his father's stoicism, and for that, Elijah was grateful. Sometimes it was better not to fill the air with questions you didn't have answers for. By midday, Miriam was hanging laundry on a line stretched behind the shed. The clean clothes flapped in the breeze, a small flag of domesticity in a wild landscape. Elijah walked by on his way to the water trough and paused. He handed her a new spool of thread he'd bought at the general store the week before. Her eyes flickered with surprise. It was a small gesture, but it was the first thing anyone had given her without expecting something in return. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded, but he didn't move on. He had to ask. "There was someone near the house last night," he said, his voice low. "Left tracks in the snow." Her hands, which had been deftly pinning a shirt to the line, froze mid-motion. "I don't know who it was or what they want," he continued, watching her face carefully. "But if there's something I should know, something that might bring trouble to this door, I need you to be honest with me, Miriam." Her eyes dropped to the snow-covered ground. "We've brought no danger, Mr. Brandt." "Are you sure about that?" She hesitated for just a second too long. "I'm as sure as I can be." It wasn't a yes, it was an evasion, and that wasn't good enough. But Elijah didn't press her, not yet. He had a feeling the truth would find its own way out. That night it snowed again, a thick, silent blanket that fell from the sky, burying the world and all its secrets. Elijah sat on the porch with his lantern and his rifle, a silent sentinel. Thomas joined him an hour later, taking up a post at the other end. The two of them sat in the quiet dark, the falling snow muffling the sounds of the world, but the figure from the woods didn't return. Not that night. Instead, the next sign arrived in the morning. It was a dead rabbit, expertly gutted and hung by its feet from the barn door. There was no note. The fresh snow had covered any footprints, but the message was brutally clear. Elijah found it just after sunrise. Ruthie was trailing behind him with the milk pail. He stopped short, blocking her view with his body. But it was too late. She'd seen it. The girl didn't scream. She didn't even gasp. She just stared at the mutilated animal, her small jaw set tight, her eyes turning to chips of ice. "Go back inside," Elijah said, his voice a low command. "I've seen worse," she whispered. "Go," he repeated, more forcefully this time. She obeyed, turning slowly and walking back to the house, the milk pail still clutched in her hand. Elijah waited until the door had closed behind her. Then he yanked the rabbit down, his hands shaking with a cold rage, and hurled it deep into the woods. He didn't tell the others. There was no sense in spreading fear if he didn't yet know what he was fighting. 3 more days passed. They were quiet, tense days filled with small chores and the unspoken weight of what was lurking in the trees. Miriam kept to herself, working tirelessly. The children worked too hard. Elijah tried to tell them to rest, to play, but they didn't seem to know how. Ruthie, especially, never stopped moving. Her shoulders were always squared, her back straight, as if she were constantly waiting for the next blow to land. It was little Lily who finally broke. Elijah found her curled up behind some grain sacks in the back of the barn, her knees pulled up to her chest, her face red and tear-streaked. She didn't see him at first. He approached quietly and crouched down beside her. "You all right, little one?" he asked gently. She flinched, wiped her face with the back of her hand, and nodded quickly. "You sure?" he pressed. Another jerky nod. He sat down beside her anyway, leaning against the rough wood of the barn wall. "My own daughter, Anna, she used to hide in this exact spot," he said, his voice soft. "The day her mother passed, she wouldn't come out for hours, just sat right here." Lily didn't respond, but she didn't run away either. "You don't have to work so hard to be invisible," Elijah said. "No one here is looking to throw you out." A tiny, choked whisper came from the small, huddled form. He used to say we had to earn our place, every single day, or we'd be sent away." Elijah's blood ran cold. "Who did?" She hesitated, then the words tumbled out. "Preston." Elijah's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. Preston, the name from the auction, the dead man. "He said we were like rats in the walls," Lily added, her voice trembling. "Said folks only let us be because they hadn't found a better use for us yet." "You are not rats," Elijah said, his voice thick with a sudden fierce anger. "You're children, and you have a place here now, a real place." She finally looked up at him, her eyes wide and uncertain. "For how long?" "For as long as you want it," he said, and he meant it. But even as the words left his lips, a part of him tensed up, because he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that somewhere out there in those woods, something was still waiting, and it wasn't going to let them go that easily. That night, Elijah decided it was time to stop waiting and start hunting. He didn't tell anyone, not even Thomas. He left a single lantern burning by the barn, just bright enough to be seen from the tree line. Then he slipped up into the hayloft, settled himself into the shadows with his rifle, and he waited. The hours crawled by. The moon was a sliver of bone in the black sky. Then, sometime past midnight, he saw it. Movement. A shadow detached itself from the darkness of the trees. It moved slowly, cautiously. It was the limping man. He wasn't just wandering by. He knew exactly where he was going. He approached the barn directly, his eyes fixed on the door. When he reached it, he raised a hand and pressed something against the wood. Elijah couldn't see what it was, but he didn't need to. He raised his rifle and fired a warning shot into the air. The crack echoed across the silent fields. The figure didn't flinch. He didn't run. Instead, he turned around slowly. And under the faint, flickering glow of the lantern, Elijah finally saw his face. He was a man in his mid-30s, with a jagged scar running down one cheek, a wild beard, and eyes that gleamed with a chilling, familiar light. "Elijah Brandt," the man said, his voice as calm and cold as the snow. Elijah lowered the rifle, just an inch. "Who are you?" "I'm here for what's mine." "You've got the wrong place, friend." "No," the man said, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "I've got the right one." And then, as quickly as he appeared, he melted back into the trees. Elijah scrambled down the ladder, his heart pounding, but by the time he reached the clearing, the man was gone. Left behind, nailed to the barn door with a hunting knife, was a piece of dirty, folded paper. Elijah pulled the knife free and unfolded the note. The script was crude, angry. "She belongs to me. I'm coming back for all of them." He stared at the words for a long, cold minute. Then he turned and walked back to the house. Miriam was awake. She was standing in the kitchen, a silhouette in the dim moonlight, as if she knew. As if she'd been waiting for this exact moment. Elijah held out the note. She took it, her fingers brushing his. She read it once. Then she read it again. Her hands began to tremble just slightly. "I asked you before, Miriam," Elijah said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Is there something I should know?" She looked up at him, and he saw something finally break behind the wall in her eyes. The dam of secrets she had so carefully constructed for so long finally crumbled. "He was never my husband," she whispered, the words tearing from her throat. "He was the man who bought me." Elijah didn't move. He stood there in the faint light of the kitchen, the woman's confession hanging between them like a ghost. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes, but the storm inside the small house was far more terrifying. "He bought you," Elijah repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. It wasn't a question. It was disbelief warring with a terrible, dawning understanding. Miriam nodded, her hands gripping the edge of the counter so tightly her knuckles were white. "Years ago, I was barely 18. My parents, they were poor, desperate. A man came to our town, a man named Preston. He came to our church with clean boots, a kind smile, and a pocket full of promises." She took a shaky breath. "He said he needed help on his property. A woman to raise his younger siblings after his parents had passed. He promised I'd be cared for, paid a fair wage. He said it would be a good Christian home." She blinked hard, her voice thinning to a thread. "He wasn't a man of God, Mr. Brandt. He was a man of power, and he knew how to use it." Elijah remained silent, not because he didn't have 1,000 questions, but because they were all tangled together in a knot of horror he wasn't sure he could unravel. "At first I thought it was just me," Miriam went on, her gaze fixed on some distant, painful memory. "I told myself I was staying for the children, his supposed siblings, but then he started collecting others." Her voice dropped even lower. "Girls, mostly, then a few boys. He told them all the same things. Promises of food, a warm bed, a purpose, a family. But once you were under his roof, you were his. You weren't a worker. You were property." The wind outside screamed, a fitting soundtrack to her story. Elijah walked to the stove and shoved another log inside, the sudden flare of the flames casting flickering, dancing shadows across his grim face. "You said he wasn't your husband," Elijah said, turning back to her. Miriam shook her head, a bitter, broken smile touching her lips. "He didn't like the word husband. He said it was too soft. He preferred the word keeper. He never married any of us in the eyes of God or the law, but he claimed us all. We were his flock." "Why didn't you run?" The question was ripped from him, raw and urgent. "I tried," she whispered. "Twice. The first time I went alone. He caught me before I made it 5 miles. The second time I took Ruthie with me." She stopped, pressing a hand to her mouth as if to hold back a sob. Her body shook with the memory. "He caught us again, and he made Ruthie watch while he taught me a lesson. He told me if I ever tried to run again, he would make her disappear. Just disappear. And he would tell the other children I had killed her with my selfishness. He'd done it before. There was another girl, Sarah. She was only 9. She tried to get away. No one ever saw her again. He told the children she got lost in the woods and was taken by wolves." Elijah gripped the handle of the stove, the hot iron searing his palm, grounding him in the horrifying present. The quiet, disciplined children, Ruthie's ancient, hardened eyes, Lily hiding in the barn. It all made a terrible, sickening kind of sense now. And the children, he started, dreading the answer. They're not his by blood, she confirmed, her voice hollow. None of them are mine either. He bought them, took them, some from the orphan trains that passed through, their papers lost along the way. Others from families so poor they couldn't afford to ask questions when a rich man offered to take a child off their hands. I raised them. I taught them what little I knew. I tried to keep them safe. I tried to keep them alive. And then he lost the property? Miriam gave a short, harsh laugh. Debt. It always catches up. He was a good showman but a terrible businessman. He spent more on guns and guards than he did on seed and soil. When the bank finally came to collect, he vanished. Just disappeared into the night a few days before the sheriff was set to arrive. She finally looked at Elijah, her eyes pleading with him to understand. He left us there, in the barn. He told the man from the bank to sell the property and to do whatever he wanted with us. Elijah let out a slow, heavy breath. The weight of it all settled on his shoulders, heavy as a tombstone. They weren't just poor. They weren't just orphans. They were survivors of a monster who was, apparently, not dead. And someone was still trying to pull the strings. That man in the woods, Elijah said, holding up the note. It wasn't Preston. No, Miriam said. That's his brother, Cyrus. More vicious than Preston, if you can believe it. He was the enforcer, the one who taught the lessons. Elijah's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a threat. This was a promise. He's back, he said, and he's coming for you. Miriam nodded, a single tear finally escaping and tracing a clean path through the grime on her cheek. If he takes us again, he won't let us live. Not after this. Not after you've shown us a different way. Elijah didn't respond right away. He walked to the window, pulled back the thin curtain, and stared out into the vast, snow-covered darkness. The world was empty and silent, but it wasn't. It was watching. He didn't turn around when he spoke, his voice low and steady, a vow made to the unforgiving night. He won't take you, he said. Not from my land. By morning, the air had turned venomous. A fresh layer of snow piled knee-high against the barn, blanketing the small house in a deceptive, pristine silence. But inside, the silence was one of grim resolve. Elijah gathered everyone in the main room, his own 3 children and Miriam's 5, a strange, fractured family forged in fear. There's a man out there, he told them, his voice calm and even, leaving no room for panic. His name is Cyrus, and he wants to harm this family. But this home is protected. You are safe here. But you must listen to every word I say, and you must be sharp. Do you understand? No one cried. No one asked questions. Even little Lily stood perfectly still, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Ruthie simply gave a single sharp nod. Then she turned and gathered the other children, whispering quiet instructions that Elijah couldn't hear. She was no longer just a child. She was a soldier. By midday, Thomas returned from his patrol. He was covered in snow, his face red from the cold, but his eyes were alert. No fresh tracks near the house, he reported. But I found an old campfire on the ridge to the west. It was still warm. He's close, and he's not alone. I counted at least 3 sets of prints. Elijah nodded grimly. His plan formed quickly, born of necessity. All right, we move the children to the storm cellar. It's tight, but it's the safest place. Thomas, you and I will rotate watches. If he or any of his men step foot on this property again, we end this. For good. But Miriam stepped forward, her face pale but determined. Let me talk to him. No, Elijah said immediately, his tone absolute. I know him, Elijah, she insisted. I know what he wants. If I face him, maybe I can stall him, give you an opening. I don't use people as bait, Miriam. You wouldn't be, she said, her voice rising with a strength he hadn't heard before. I would be choosing. They are my children, Elijah. I have to do something to protect them. I have to. He stared at her for a long, hard moment, seeing the steel in her spine. He looked away, his jaw tight. "Not yet," he said. "Not unless we have no other choice." That night they prepared for war. Elijah and Thomas built decoys along the porch, bundles of old cloth and straw dressed in coats and hats, positioned to look like men standing guard. They lit a few extra lanterns and hung them from hooks, letting them sway in the wind, casting moving, lifelike silhouettes against the house. Then, they extinguished all the other lights and waited in the darkness. The hours crawled by, the wind slowed to a whisper, the snow softened, the world holding its breath. And then, just before the blackness of the sky began to fade to gray, the barn door creaked. It wasn't the sound of it opening, it was the sound of weight shifting against it. A whisper of movement. Elijah raised his rifle, his own breath tight in his chest. He was hidden in the shadows of the porch, perfectly still. Another creak, then a single heavy footstep, crunching in the snow. He signaled to Thomas, who was hidden at the far end of the house. His son began to creep silently around the side, moving toward the back. Suddenly, another figure detached itself from the trees, and then another. 3 men. No, 4. They were moving with a purpose, guns held low and ready. This wasn't a simple threat anymore. This was an invasion. Elijah's mouth hardened into a thin, grim line. They weren't just coming for Miriam. They were going to take them all by force. He raised his rifle, took aim, and fired the first shot. Not at the men. He fired into the air, a warning, a line drawn in the snow. "Turn back," he shouted, his voice booming across the silent fields. "You cross that line to the barn, and you don't leave this property alive." A rough laugh echoed from the woods. One of the men, a big, burly figure, stepped forward, raising his own pistol. "You can't stop us, old man. This land's been claimed. You're trespassing on what ain't yours." Elijah fired again. This time the bullet kicked up a spray of snow and dirt just inches from the man's feet. He stumbled back with a curse. "I filed the deed with the county clerk 3 days ago," Elijah called out, his voice ringing with authority. "And you've filed nothing but threats. You step one more foot onto this homestead, and you'll be buried on it." A long, tense silence followed. The remaining men looked at each other, uncertain. Then, a new voice rang out from the darkness. It was colder, smoother, and infinitely more dangerous than the others. It was the voice from the barn, Cyrus. "Elijah Brandt," he called, stepping out from behind a large oak tree. "I gave you a chance to be reasonable, to hand them over without bloodshed." "They're not yours to take," Elijah shouted back. "They are now," Cyrus said calmly. There was another long pause, then the sound of retreating footsteps. The 4 shadows melted back into the trees, taking their wounded with them. But Elijah knew. This wasn't the end. This was just a test of his defenses. The real storm was still coming. By sunrise, Thomas was laying new traps along the perimeter, digging pits and rigging tripwires with a grim focus. Elijah moved the children into the cramped, musty storm cellar. Ruthie insisted on sitting closest to the door, a small, rusted hatchet clutched in her hands. "They'll come back," she said, her voice a low murmur, "but not all at once. Cyrus likes to test the edges first. He'll look for the weak spots. He always does." Elijah crouched down in front of her. "How do you know that, Ruthie?" She just looked at him with those old, haunted eyes and didn't answer. She didn't have to. That afternoon, while Miriam was folding blankets in the kitchen, her movements jerky and anxious, Elijah sat across from her. "Miriam," he asked quietly, "what would he do? If he got to you, to the children? Tell me the truth." Her hands paused their work. She stared at the worn fabric. "He'd break us up," she said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "He would punish the older ones, me and Ruthie, make an example of us. He would send the younger girls off to other keepers like Preston. And you? He would kill you. Slowly." Elijah took that in, his face as calm and cold as ice. "Then I guess we don't let him." They came again the next night, just 2 of them this time, a smaller scouting party, testing the waters just as Ruthie had predicted. But they didn't know that Thomas had taken up a new position in the hayloft of the barn, his rifle resting on a bale of hay. The first man crept toward the chicken coop, thinking it was an unguarded flank. One clean shot from the loft. The man dropped without a sound, a dark stain spreading in the snow. The second man panicked. He turned and ran, scrambling back toward the safety of the trees. Thomas didn't fire again. He let him go. He let him carry the message back to his master. In the snow beside the dead man's body, they found a note pinned to his vest. "You shed our blood, we will shed yours. You have been warned." Elijah stared at the note for a moment, then crumpled it in his fist and tossed it into the hearth fire. He didn't believe in monsters, but he believed in men who wore the skin of one, and he knew Cyrus was no coward. Next time, he would bring the real fight. By the 4th day, the strain was showing. The children had stopped speaking during meals. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the house made them flinch. Grace cried constantly at night, a thin, terrified wail that Lily tried to muffle against her shoulder. Elijah couldn't stand it anymore. He gathered them all in the parlor, the heart of the house. He pulled out the old family Bible, its leather cover worn smooth by his own father's hands, and laid it on the table. "This house," he said, his voice slow and deliberate, speaking to every person in the room. "This house belongs to God first, and then it belongs to the people he has put in my care. And that includes all of you now." He looked at each of them, from Miriam down to little Grace. "You didn't ask for this life. None of you did. But you were made strong enough to survive it, and so was I. So we are going to hold fast, and whatever comes through those trees, we will face it, together." For the first time in all the days he had known her, Ruthie let a single tear roll down her cheek. She wiped it away angrily, then nodded. Later that night, as the wind began to howl again, a promise of another storm, Elijah sat in the dark with his rifle and a cup of cold coffee. He watched the shadows dance across the roof of the barn. He watched the trees bend and sway. And then, when the wind shifted just right, he heard it, a voice carried on the air from the edge of the woods. It wasn't loud, it wasn't angry, it was calm, cold, and utterly final. "I'm coming tomorrow at dusk, Brant, and when I do, I will take back what is mine, and I will burn the rest to the ground." The morning came colder than any that had come before. Thin, skeletal fingers of frost climbed the window panes, trying to claw their way inside. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing orange embers, and Elijah stood before it, stoking them back to life with a heavy, deliberate hand. He hadn't slept. The whole house felt like it was holding its breath. Cyrus's voice from the woods the night before hadn't been a threat. It had been an appointment. Tomorrow at dusk. There was no bluff in it, no empty bluster. Elijah had heard enough men lie in his life to know what the cold, hard truth sounded like. Cyrus was coming, and he wasn't coming alone. Elijah turned from the fire and saw Thomas was already by the door, fastening the last buttons on his heavy coat. His son's face was grim, set in hard lines that made him look older than his 14 years. "I'll check the traps," Thomas said, his voice low as he slung his rifle strap over his shoulder. "See if they left anything behind during the night." "Take the long path, around the north pasture," Elijah warned. "If they're watching, and they are, they won't expect that route. Keep your eyes open, son." Thomas nodded once, a quick, sharp jerk of his head, and slipped out into the icy morning. His boots crunched on the hard-packed snow, the sound quickly swallowed by the vast, oppressive silence. Miriam came into the room a few moments later. Her eyes were hollow, shadowed with the exhaustion of another sleepless night. She poured hot water from the kettle into a cracked mug and leaned against the kitchen counter, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames in the stove. "He won't stop," she said, her voice a near whisper. "Not until he breaks something. Or someone." Elijah didn't argue. He'd come to the same conclusion during the long, dark hours of the night. "I don't think he even wants the children anymore," she added quietly, her voice laced with a new kind of dread. "Not really. Not like Preston did." "Then what does he want?" Elijah asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. She finally looked at him, her eyes mirroring the fear in his own heart. "He wants to win. He wants to destroy the people who took that win away from him." Elijah finally turned to face her fully. "I've faced men like him before," he said, his voice rough. "They build their entire world around two things: fear and obedience. You take those away from them, and all they have left is rage. And a man running on pure rage is a dangerous thing." She looked toward the cellar door, where the children were still sleeping, huddled together for warmth and comfort, their small bodies linked as if their unity was the only shield they had left. "When he comes through those trees at dusk," Elijah said, his voice dropping to a low growl, "he's going to find more than he bargained for." By mid-morning, Thomas returned. He was holding a scrap of dark cloth in his gloved hand, and there was a smear of blood on the cuff of his coat. "They're close," he said, tossing the scrap onto the kitchen table. "Looks like one of them got tangled in the wire we set near the old orchard. It's not a clean cut. Looks like it tore straight through his coat and into muscle." Miriam winced. "They'll be angrier now. Let them be," Elijah muttered. "Angry men make stupid choices." He turned to his son. "We need to dig trenches behind the barn, set up blockades along the south fence line, and double the tripwires near the chicken coop." He paused, then looked at Miriam. "I need Ruthie. She's quick and she's smart. Let her guide you, Thomas. She knows how Cyrus thinks. She knows his blind spots." "What about the other children?" Miriam asked, her eyes darting toward the cellar. "We move them, but not to the cellar this time. He'll expect that. Grace and Lily, they go into the crawl space under the parlor. It's small, but it's hidden. Jacob and Isaiah, they'll stay in the attic, by the hatch. If anything goes wrong, they'll have a way out onto the roof." "If anything goes wrong," she echoed, her voice trembling. "You think we won't make it through this?" Elijah stepped closer to her, his presence a solid, grounding force in the swirling chaos. "I'm preparing for the worst," he said, his eyes locking with hers. "But I am not surrendering." She held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded, the fear in her eyes replaced by a flicker of something harder. Something that looked like a fight. By late afternoon, the homestead had been transformed into a fortress. Elijah had armed himself with his father's old hunting rifle, a heavy sidearm passed down from his uncle, and a long, sharp knife he hadn't worn on his belt since the war. They weren't new, but they were reliable tools in steady, determined hands. Thomas and Ruthie came back from the barn just as the sun began its slow descent, their coats covered in frost, their faces flushed with exertion. "Trenches are set," Thomas reported. "If they try to flank us from the rear, they'll run straight into them." "They won't flank," Ruthie added, her voice surprisingly firm. "Cyrus doesn't sneak when he thinks he can bully. He'll come straight on, from the front." As if on cue, as the sky turned the color of a deep, angry bruise, Elijah saw them. He was standing on the porch, his rifle held across his chest, waiting. At first, they were just shadows detaching from the tree line. Then they became shapes, 5 figures, walking side by side, a human hunting line. They had no horses, no wagons, just boots, guns, and long coats that were dark against the snow. Cyrus walked in the middle. His coat was trimmed with black wool, and his face was clean-shaven, as if he had prepared for this moment, like a gentleman dressing for a duel. He stopped about 20 yards from the house, the cold air smoking around him. "Elijah Brandt!" he called out, his voice calm, cold, and carrying easily across the frozen ground. "You've made a terrible mistake." Elijah didn't move. "You made it first, when you trespassed on my land. I offered you mercy. You refused it." "I don't call threats and intimidation mercy." Cyrus smiled, a faint, chilling thing. He motioned with his hand. 2 of his men immediately split off, one heading right, one heading left, both moving toward the fence lines where Thomas and Ruthie had spent the day setting their traps. "I'll say this one last time, Brant," Cyrus said, his voice rising with theatrical authority. "Bring me the woman. Bring me the children. Step aside, and no one else in your house has to suffer." "They are not yours," Elijah said, his voice a low growl. Cyrus's smile vanished. "So be it." The first explosion was faint, a sharp crack from a small powder charge buried beneath the fence line to the right. One of Cyrus's men went down hard, smoke curling from his leg. He screamed once, a high, thin sound, then went silent. The second came a moment later from the opposite side. One of Thomas's traps, a net weighted with sharpened spikes, sprang up from under the snow, wrapping around the legs of the other man. He howled in pain and fury, dropping his weapon and crawling backward in a panic. Elijah stepped down from the porch, his rifle raised and ready. "You've already lost 2 men," he called out. "Turn back now and live." Cyrus stood his ground, his eyes narrowed to slits. Then he raised his arm and dropped it. Gunfire erupted from the trees behind him. 2 more men, hidden until now, burst from the shadows, firing toward the hayloft of the barn where Thomas had taken his position. Bullets thudded into the old wood, splintering beams and kicking up sprays of snow. A scream came from inside the house. Miriam. Elijah whirled and fired twice into the chaos. One of the attackers crumpled to the ground. The other stumbled but kept moving, firing wildly toward the house. From the loft, Thomas fired back. His single shot was true. The second attacker collapsed with a grunt and didn't get up again. Unfazed, Cyrus started walking forward straight toward the house, drawing his own pistol. "Stay down!" Elijah shouted toward the house, his heart pounding. He didn't get an answer, but he knew Miriam was moving the children, keeping them safe. He met Cyrus halfway, his rifle still trained on the man's chest, his breath steaming in the frigid air. "You don't win this," Elijah said. Cyrus stopped just 10 feet away, a look of utter contempt on his face. "You think your kindness makes you strong, old man?" he sneered. "It makes you weak. These people you're so determined to save, they will cost you everything." "No," Elijah said, his voice shaking with a sudden, powerful conviction. "They're the reason I still have something worth fighting for." Cyrus raised his pistol. Elijah fired first. The bullet caught Cyrus in the shoulder, the impact spinning him around and dropping him into the snow. But he didn't scream. He didn't even curse. He just gritted his teeth, a low growl escaping his lips as he tried to rise. Elijah moved forward, his gun still raised, but Cyrus's last remaining man rushed in from the side, tackling Elijah with the force of a battering ram. They went down in a heap, wrestling in the snowdrift. The rifle flew from Elijah's grasp. Fists and elbows flew. The biting cold sank into Elijah's bones like ice water through his coat. But Elijah wasn't a young man anymore. He was a survivor. He'd fought bigger men, angrier men. He grabbed the man's collar, used his momentum, and slammed the man's head backward into the hard, hidden stump of a tree beneath the snow. Once, twice. The man went limp. Elijah staggered to his feet, his chest heaving, a trickle of blood running from a cut on his cheek. He looked up. Cyrus was on his hands and knees, crawling toward his dropped pistol. "Elijah!" It was Miriam's voice. She was standing on the porch, a heavy shotgun held in her hands, her face a mask of fierce determination. Elijah scrambled for his own rifle, but he wasn't the only one who had come to fight. Ruthie stepped out from behind Miriam. She was holding a heavy iron fire poker, her hands trembling, but her feet were planted firmly on the wooden planks of the porch. Her eyes were fixed on Cyrus, burning with a hatred that was 100 years old. Cyrus looked from the woman with the shotgun to the child with the poker. He looked at the last of his men, unconscious or dead in the snow. Then he looked at Elijah, standing over him, bloodied but unbroken. And finally, with a look of utter defeat, he dropped his pistol. They locked him in the storm cellar for the night, bound, bloodied, and finally silent. The sheriff arrived the next day, summoned by a telegram Thomas had sent to a neighboring town days before. He brought 2 deputies with him. They took statements, inspected the blood-stained ground, and cataloged the weapons. When the sheriff opened the cellar door and saw Cyrus huddled in the corner, he didn't even ask for an explanation. He just sighed and said, "Took long enough for someone to finally stop him." Cyrus and his men were hauled away without ceremony. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the wind whistling through the trees didn't sound like a warning anymore. It just sounded like the wind. That night, Elijah sat on the porch, a thick coat wrapped around his bruised shoulders, and stared up at the brilliant, cold stars. Miriam came out and sat beside him, not speaking. After a long time, she said softly, "You didn't have to fight for us." Elijah didn't look at her. He just kept his eyes on the heavens. "I wasn't fighting for you," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "I was fighting for what's right. You and those children. You just reminded me what that looks like." Inside the small, warm house, 8 children were finally sleeping peacefully. For the first time, there was no fear in their dreams, just the quiet promise of a new day. The snow began to melt, not with the gentle promise of spring, but in a slow, grudging retreat. It left behind slush in the barn gutters, treacherous sheets of ice between the house and the outbuildings, and deep patches of mud that could swallow a boot whole. But the air felt different. It was still cold, still sharp, but the oppressive weight of dread that had clung to the eaves of the roof and the dark corners of every room had finally lifted. Elijah stood by the stove, watching steam curl from the coffee pot. From upstairs he could hear the muffled sound of laughter, real laughter. Jacob and his own youngest son, Sam, had discovered an old wooden puzzle in a forgotten chest and were piecing it together with a shared, determined focus. Ruthie, who rarely showed any emotion, would occasionally peek over their shoulders and offer a quiet suggestion, a ghost of a smile on her lips. Miriam leaned in the doorway, her apron dusted with flour, watching them with an expression Elijah couldn't quite name. It was a fragile thing, a mixture of profound grief for all they had lost and a tentative, burgeoning hope for what they might build. "You should rest," she said, her voice breaking the comfortable quiet of the morning. "Those bruises on your side are turning black." Elijah glanced down at his ribs. The scuffle with Cyrus's last man had left him stiff and aching. "Later," he said. "The barn needs checking. Some of those bullets went clean through the west wall." Miriam didn't argue. She simply nodded and turned back to the children. But Elijah saw the way her eyes lingered on him, a flicker of a new kind of worry in their depths, a fear that he might walk out that door and not come back. It was a fear he understood all too well. He found Thomas out by the lower pasture, methodically pulling apart the last of the tripwires and dismantling the traps. The boy worked with a grim efficiency, his hands red with cold, but his eyes kept scanning the distant tree line, a habit that Elijah knew would take a long time to break. "We'll need to fill in those trenches before the full thaw," Thomas said, standing up as Elijah approached. "Don't want one of the horses breaking a leg." "I'll help with it this afternoon," Elijah replied, his gaze following his son's out toward the horizon. There was nothing there but empty, snow-dusted hills. "Sheriff said Cyrus's men scattered to the 4 winds," Thomas said, as if reading his mind. "Most of them were just hired guns, had no real loyalty to him, said Cyrus paid in threats, not coin." "That sounds about right," Elijah muttered. The silence between them was different now. It was no longer the tense, suspicious quiet of their first few weeks together. It was comfortable, easy. Thomas stood straighter, his shoulders squared, a young man who had been forced to become a man overnight. Elijah felt a surge of pride so fierce it almost hurt. "You fought like someone who's lost before," Thomas said suddenly, his eyes still on the horizon. Elijah didn't reply at first. The wind whispered through the bare branches of the trees behind them. "I have," he said finally. "Your wife," Thomas stated, not as a question. Elijah nodded once. "And a son," Your brother. He was just a baby. Thomas swallowed hard, his face tight with an emotion he didn't know how to express. I'm sorry. I know, Elijah said softly. They stood there for another long moment. Then Thomas looked back toward the house, where the warm light of the fire was visible in the windows. Miriam said you were different, he said, right from the very beginning. She said she knew. Elijah felt something stir in his chest, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in 3 long, lonely years, something he wasn't sure he was ready to face. He cleared his throat and turned toward the barn. Come on, he said, his voice gruff. Let's get this work done before the next freeze sets in. That evening, the first letter arrived. It wasn't delivered by a rider. It wasn't handed off by a deputy. It had been slipped silently under the front door, left without a knock, without a sound. Miriam found it when she went to bolt the door for the night. It was folded in half, her name scrolled on the outside in a tight, almost frantic handwriting. She opened it by the flickering light of the fire, and Elijah watched as her face grew paler with every line she read. What is it? He asked, his body tensing. She looked up, her eyes wide with shock and confusion. It's from my brother. Elijah froze. You told me you didn't have any family left. I thought I didn't, she whispered, her voice trembling as she handed him the letter. Elijah took the single sheet of paper. The words were short, clipped, the sentences tangled with what looked like guilt and desperation. It was a plea. The writer, a man named Matthew, claimed their father was gravely ill, that the family farm was falling apart without help. He said he regretted what had happened all those years ago, letting their father sell her to Preston. He was begging her to come home. Do you believe him? Elijah asked, his voice low. Miriam shook her head, her gaze lost in the flames. I don't know what to believe anymore. Do you want to go? She looked up at him, her eyes filled with years of unspoken pain. I don't know that either. The house was quiet that night. A new kind of tension had settled over them. Even Ruthie seemed subdued, as if she could sense that the ground beneath their feet had shifted once again. When the younger children were finally asleep, Miriam sat at the kitchen table, staring at the letter as if it might burn a hole through the wood. I'm scared to hope, she confessed to the quiet room. You're allowed to be, Elijah said, taking the seat across from her. What if it's a lie? She whispered. What if they just want to take the children? What if it's another trap? Elijah thought of Preston, of Cyrus, of the cold-eyed men who saw people as property. Then you don't go, he said simply. And if it's real, if they've really changed, then they can come here. If they mean what they say, they'll come to you, without demands. 3 days passed, then 5. The letter sat on the mantelpiece, a silent, unanswered question. No reply came from Miriam's brother. No messenger appeared on the horizon, no wagon on the long, empty road. Miriam never mentioned it, but Elijah could see the hope draining from her face with each passing day. She had stopped watching the road. The barn got repaired, slowly but surely. Elijah found the damage from the gunfight wasn't as bad as he had feared. He taught Thomas how to mend harnesses and patch fence posts, finding a quiet satisfaction in passing on the skills his own father had taught him. One afternoon, as the last of the snow melted in dirty slivers, Elijah found Jacob on the porch with a nail in one hand and a hammer that was far too big for him in the other. He was trying to fix a loose floorboard. "What are you doing there, son?" Elijah asked. "This board's loose," Jacob said, pointing. "It squeaks whenever Mama steps on it. Ruthie says it's annoying." Elijah knelt beside him, his old knees protesting. He gently guided the boy's small hand. "Here," he said, "let's fix it right." They pounded the nail in together. When it was done, Jacob looked up at him and smiled, a real proud smile. Without thinking, Elijah ruffled the boy's hair. The gesture caught both of them by surprise. It was the first truly fatherly thing he had done for one of Miriam's children. Jacob didn't pull away, and neither did Elijah. It was on the 6th morning after the letter had arrived that the rider came. He wasn't a stranger. He wasn't a deputy. It was Miriam's brother. He rode in on a horse that was worn thin, his own face etched with a look of shame so heavy it seemed to weigh him down in the saddle. He didn't dismount right away. He just sat at the edge of the gate, as if he wasn't sure he would be welcome. Miriam stepped out onto the porch before Elijah could say a word. "Matthew," she said, her voice flat, unreadable. He tipped his hat, his hands shaking slightly from the cold. "Miriam, you got the letter then?" "I did. I meant every word," he said, his voice thick. She crossed her arms over her chest, a protective barrier. "Then why did you wait 6 days to come?" He visibly winced, as if she'd struck him. "I didn't think I'd have the nerve," he confessed, finally swinging down from his horse. "I kept telling myself I could write another letter, explain things better. But there's no explaining what I did, what I let happen to you." Elijah stood a step behind Miriam, a silent, watchful presence. The children were peering out the window, their faces a mixture of curiosity and fear. Matthew looked past Miriam, toward the house. "I didn't come here to take anything," he said, his voice earnest. "I only came to ask if there was any way I could help make it right." "You can't undo the past, Matthew." "I know that," he said, his eyes filled with a deep, old sadness. "But maybe I can help you build the future." Miriam didn't answer for a long time. Then she stepped aside. "Come inside," she said. "But this time, you listen first." That night, for the first time since he had arrived, Matthew laughed. It wasn't a loud or carefree sound, but it was real. He watched the children pass a plate of freshly baked bread around the table. He watched Elijah add more vegetables to the stew pot without a word of complaint. He watched Miriam hum softly to herself as she worked. Later, when the children were in bed and the profound silence of the plains had settled over them like a worn quilt, Matthew stood on the porch beside Elijah. "She was always the strongest of us," Matthew said, staring out into the darkness. Elijah didn't disagree. "I wasn't much of a man back then," Matthew added, his voice filled with self-loathing. "Letting our father chase her away, turning my back on my own sister. I've lived with that ghost every day." "You came back," Elijah said simply. "Some men never do." Matthew looked over at him, his expression serious in the dim moonlight. "You love her?" It wasn't a question. Elijah was quiet for a long moment, the truth of the words settling in his own heart. "She saved me," he said finally. "Not with kindness, but with courage, with truth." Matthew nodded slowly. "Then don't you waste it, Brant." But not every storm ends just because the clouds lift. 2 days later, another rider came. This one was a stranger, a dirty, wind-burnt man on a horse lathered with sweat. He wasn't there to offer peace. He was carrying a warning. "The men who followed Cyrus, they scattered," the rider said, refusing to even dismount. "But they didn't go far. They've found someone new to lead them. They're regrouping west of town. They're saying the man who stopped Cyrus humiliated them all. They're saying they're coming back to set things right." Elijah's jaw clenched. Miriam's face, which had just begun to lose its haunted look, fell. Matthew looked from his sister's terrified expression to Elijah's grim, hard face. He straightened up, his own features setting into a mask of cold resolve. "Well," Matthew said, his voice low and steady, "then I guess I'm not leaving just yet." The final storm was on its way. The winter sun barely had the strength to climb above the horizon, its weak light casting long blue shadows across the scarred fields. The house was quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the silence of fear. It was the heavy, waiting silence of a garrison before a battle. The rider's warning had settled in Elijah's chest like a shard of ice. He knew this was it. This was the end of the line. There would be no more warnings, no more second chances. Preston's men, now led by some new devil, weren't coming to negotiate. They were coming for blood. They were coming to finish what Cyrus had started. Miriam didn't speak much that day. She went back to kneading bread with stiff, methodical movements, her knuckles white, her jaw set. The children could feel the change in the air. Jacob and Sam stayed close to each other, their eyes constantly flicking toward the windows. Even Ruthie had stopped her quiet humming. And Thomas, Elijah's son, had become someone else entirely. He was no longer a boy. He moved with a quiet purpose, helping Elijah check the weak spots in the fence, reinforcing the shutters on the windows, even fashioning crude, sharp-ended spears from broken fence posts. His silence was one of grim preparation. The next morning, before the sun was up, Elijah saddled his mare and rode for the nearest town. The sheriff met him on the steps of his office, his face tired and grim. "It's bad, Elijah," the sheriff said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "They're camped out west of Cedar Hollow, at least a dozen of them, maybe more, and they're well armed. Who's leading them?" "Name's Jerome Tiller," the sheriff said. "An ex-railroad man. Got run off for being too violent even for the company men. He's been gathering up stragglers and malcontents for months. Word is, he blames you personally for what happened to Preston and Cyrus. Thinks you made them all look like fools. He's looking to make an example out of you." Elijah took that in without flinching. "How long do we have?" "Hard to say, but if I know men like Tiller, and I do, they'll wait for the thaw to turn the ground to mud. They'll come when no one's expecting it." Elijah nodded. "Then we'll be ready." The sheriff looked at him, his eyes filled with a weary concern. "You planning on standing your ground again, Elijah? You can't fight a dozen men." "I don't run," Elijah said. It was the simplest, truest thing he knew. The sheriff sighed, then handed Elijah a small, heavy bundle of cartridges. "Don't go looking for trouble, Elijah," he said. "But if it finds you, you send a message." Back at the ranch, Elijah gathered the whole family in the main room after supper. The fire crackled softly in the hearth. The wind outside carried the low, mournful whine of the approaching dusk. "They're coming," he said simply. The children stiffened. Miriam closed her eyes for a single long beat, then opened them again, her gaze steady. "How long?" she asked. "Not sure. A week. Maybe less." "What do they want?" Jacob asked, his voice a small whisper in the big room. "They want to take what we wouldn't give them before," Elijah answered, his eyes on the boy. "They want to make us afraid." "We won't give them anything," Thomas said, his voice hard. "No," Elijah agreed. "We won't." Miriam stepped forward. Matthew stood up and moved to stand beside her, a silent show of solidarity. "But we won't let this place turn into a battlefield again," she said, her voice firm. "Not with the children in the middle of it." "We'll prepare quietly," Elijah said. "Carefully. They won't find us weak, but we won't provoke them either." "Then what do we do?" Grace asked, her small voice trembling. Elijah looked at all of them, his strange, broken, beautiful family. "We live," he said. "We do our chores, we eat our meals, we stay ready, and we trust each other." He didn't say it aloud, but he knew the truth in his heart. This would be the final test, not of their strength, but of their faith in one another. The week crawled by like a wounded animal. Each day brought new subtle signs of the closing circle. Fresh boot prints found at the edge of the property line, a single fence post knocked over in the night. A tree branch snapped where no wind could have reached it. They were being watched, scouted, their defenses tested. Matthew took to riding the perimeter each morning, his shotgun resting across his lap. He hadn't hesitated when Elijah told him the full truth of what was coming. He'd just nodded once, saddled his horse, and ridden out. Elijah cleaned the rifles every single night, the methodical task calming his frayed nerves. Miriam would sit across from him, mending a shirt or darning a sock, her eyes flicking to his hands every time he paused. "You don't have to face this alone," she said quietly one night, her voice barely a whisper. "I know." "I mean it, Elijah. You've carried so much, for so long." He set down the rifle he was cleaning, his hands stained with oil. He exhaled slowly. "Some burdens aren't meant to be put down, Miriam." "No," she said, her eyes meeting his across the flickering firelight. "But they are meant to be shared." He didn't answer. He couldn't. Not yet. The attack didn't come at dawn, as he had expected. It came in the dead of night. There was no warning, no shouting. Just the sudden, sharp crack of gunfire in the cold, still air, and the sound of a window shattering in one of the upstairs bedrooms. Elijah was out of bed before the sound of the glass hitting the floor had faded. He grabbed his rifle, already shouting, "Down! Everyone down!" Miriam was already there, pulling the younger children from their beds and herding them toward the stairwell. Thomas, acting on pure instinct, threw a heavy wooden chair against the back door, just as another bullet punched through the frame, splintering the wood. "They're flanking!" Matthew shouted from an upstairs window. "Left and right!" Elijah moved fast, a shadow in the darkness of his own home. He dropped one man near the barn, his form briefly illuminated by the bright orange flash from his muzzle. Another man made a run for the chicken coop and was met with a blast from Matthew's shotgun from the window above. "It's a feint," Elijah muttered to himself, his mind racing. "They're trying to draw us out." But the men outside were different this time. They were careful, organized. They stayed behind cover, returned fire sparingly, and they were patient. Terribly, horribly patient. The hours passed in a terrifying blur of gunfire, splintering wood, and shouted commands. At one point, a deathly silence fell over the property. Elijah used the lull to move the children down into the storm cellar. They were pale and wide-eyed but silent, huddled together in their blankets. He gave Ruthie a quick kiss on the forehead and told Jacob to keep them quiet, no matter what he heard. Then he turned to Miriam. Her face was smudged with soot, her eyes blazing. "If they break through that door, I will fight," she said, gripping the heavy pistol he had given her. "You don't need to ask me again." He nodded once. "Good." It ended as suddenly as it had begun. A shot rang out from the darkness, followed by a scream. Then a new voice bellowed from outside, a voice full of gravel and fury. "Brant! Elijah Brant! You come out now and maybe I won't burn your whole damn place to the ground!" Jerome Tiller. He was a bigger man than Preston, older, with a face like rusted iron and hands that looked like they had broken more men than they had shaken. Elijah stepped out onto the porch, his rifle held at the ready. "You've made your point, Tiller." Tiller laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Not yet, I haven't. You humiliated good men. You took what should have been theirs. Now I'm here to finish it." "You want revenge," Elijah said. "I want justice," Tiller roared. "You'll get a bullet," Elijah growled back. Tiller's sick smile vanished. "I know what you lost, Brant. I know what kind of man you used to be. Men like us, we don't get to live soft. We don't get to play house and pretend we can raise families and forget the things we've done." Elijah's jaw tightened. "I haven't forgotten a single thing." "Then prove it," Tiller challenged. "Face me, just you and me. No more hiding behind women and children." At that, Miriam appeared beside Elijah on the porch, her own face a mask of cold fury. "You think he's hiding?" she called out, her voice ringing with contempt. "You're the one who needs a dozen men to feel brave." Tiller sneered at her. "You'll regret that, woman." "No," she said, her voice clear and strong. "You will." And she raised the pistol in her hand and fired. The shot caught Tiller in the leg. It wasn't a killing shot, but it was enough to take him off his feet, to break his posture of command. And that moment of shock was all Elijah needed. He charged forward off the porch, his rifle blazing. In the ensuing chaos, Thomas and Matthew flanked the remaining men from either side of the house. The battle didn't last long after that. The ambushers were hired hands, not true believers. With their leader down, their will to fight dissolved. They scattered like dry leaves in a harsh wind, melting back into the darkness from which they came. The sun rose over a bloodied field and a weary, battered house. Elijah sat on the porch steps, his shirt torn, his hands stained, his breath steaming in the cold morning air. Miriam came and sat beside him, wrapping a wool blanket around his shoulders. "We won," she said softly. Elijah looked out at the quiet fields, at the rising sun. No, he said, his voice thick with emotion. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. We survived. She leaned her head against his shoulder. For us, she whispered, that's the same thing. In the quiet that followed, the first birds of morning began to sing. The long winter was finally over. The land was theirs, the family was whole, and as the sun crested the ridge, spilling its pale gold light across their small, hard-won piece of the world, Elijah Brant knew, with a certainty that filled every part of his soul, that he was finally home. If you enjoyed this story of resilience and redemption, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more tales of courage from the forgotten corners of history. What would you have done in Elijah's place? Let us know in the comments below.